The sun did not merely shine on the New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878. It hammered against the earth until the ground cracked and surrendered. To the west. The mesas stood like bruised knuckles against a sky so vast and relentlessly blue that it made a man feel insignificant just by looking up. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the scorched scrub brush and the dry arroyos where water had not run since the previous winter. Ezra Holt stood on the porch of the main house, one hand resting on the rough-hewn railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the heat shimmer danced like restless ghosts. From a distance, the Broken Creek Ranch looked like a fortress of American resilience. The barn was built of solid timber dragged down from the high country. The corrals were straight and reinforced with iron, and the main house had a limestone foundation that suggested permanence. But Ezra knew the truth that the architecture hid. The ranch was bleeding, and the wound was not one that could be stitched. He wiped a layer of grit from his forehead with a blue handkerchief. At 42, Ezra was a man carved from the same hard material as the land he worked. He was tall, with shoulders that had taken a permanent set from carrying burdens, both physical and invisible. His face was lined deep around the eyes and mouth, a map of long days and short nights, since Clara died 3 years ago, taken by a fever that burned through her in 3 days. The silence in the house had become a second presence. He had learned to live with it, just as he lived with the drought. He was disciplined, quiet, and fiercely loyal to the few things he had left, his father's land and the men who relied on him for their wages. But wages were becoming a problem. The rumors had started in town 4 months ago and had moved across the territory like a plague wind. Silas Crow and his syndicate were moving south. They were not ranchers in the way Ezra understood the word. They were a machine. They bought land not to tend it, but to consume it. They controlled the water rights, squeezed the supply lines, and when a small rancher finally broke under the pressure, Crow was there to buy the deed for pennies on the dollar. Just last week, the Miller place to the east had gone silent. Tom Miller had been talking about holding out until the autumn rains, but then his barn burned down on a Tuesday night. By Friday, the deed was signed over to the syndicate, and Miller was on a wagon heading for California. Ezra descended the porch steps, his boots crunching on the gravel. He headed toward the corral where his foreman, Pike, was overseeing the shoeing of a mare. Pike was a heavy man with a beard that looked like steel wool and a disposition that was twice as abrasive. He was good with cattle but had a mean streak that Ezra had to keep on a short leash. Pike looked up as Ezra approached, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "The water in the north tank is low," Pike said, wiping his mouth with the back of his glove. "If we do not get rain by the end of the month, we are going to have to drive the herd up to the high pasture. And you know Crow has men patrolling those fences now. They claim the grazing rights are disputed. They can claim the moon is made of cheese," Ezra said, his voice a low rumble. "That grazing land has been deeded to this ranch since '55. Paper does not stop a bullet." "Ezra." Pike dropped the hoof he was holding and straightened up. "The boys are getting edgy. 3 of them asked for their pay early yesterday. They hear things in town. They say Crow is hiring riders at $40 a month. That is double what we pay. Let them go if they want to go," Ezra said. "I only want men here who know where they stand." He walked away before Pike could argue, but the knot in his stomach tightened. Loyalty was a fine thing, but it did not feed a family or keep a man from looking over his shoulder. Ezra walked past the bunkhouse and out toward the gate that marked the entrance to the ranch proper. He needed to check the southern fence line, but something on the road caught his eye. It was a figure, distorted by the waves of heat, walking slowly toward the gate. Ezra narrowed his eyes. It was rare for anyone to come out this far on foot. As the figure drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman leading a horse that favored its left foreleg. She walked with a steady, determined gait, ignoring the dust that coated her dark skirt and the heat that must have been baking her alive. He waited by the gate, his hands resting on his belt. When she finally stopped 10 feet from him, Ezra saw that she was exhausted, but she did not look defeated. She was Mexican-American, perhaps 30 years old, with skin the color of polished saddle leather and eyes that were black, sharp, and utterly devoid of fear. She wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a man's work shirt that was too large for her, and a long skirt that had been patched in 3 places. She did not speak immediately. Instead, her eyes dropped to Ezra's waist. She looked at his gun belt, checking the position of the revolver, then shifted her gaze to his hands. She scanned his knuckles for fresh bruises or rings. It was a look Ezra had seen before, usually on soldiers who had spent too much time in Indian country. She was checking for threats. She was calculating whether violence was the next language she would have to speak. Only after she had finished her assessment did she look him in the face. "I am looking for work," she said. Her voice was husky, parched from the dust, but her English was clear. Ezra looked at the horse behind her. It was a good animal, an Appaloosa, but it was lame. "I am not hiring cooks," Ezra said, "and I have a washerwoman who comes out from town once a month." "I am not a cook," she said. "I am a trainer. I can break anything with 4 legs and a bad temper. My name is Lucia Reyes." Ezra looked her over again. She was slight, wiry rather than muscular. The idea of her breaking a 1,200-pound stallion seemed absurd, and yet there was a stillness about her that gave him pause. Most people fidgeted under his silence. She didn't move. "You walked a long way to tell a joke." "Miss Reyes," Ezra said, "it is no joke. I need work. I need grain for my horse and a place to sleep. I will work for half of what you pay your men until you see what I can do." Ezra unlatched the gate and swung it open. He did not know why he did it. Perhaps it was the desperation in her offer, or perhaps it was the fact that she had looked at his gun before she looked at his eyes. He recognized that kind of caution. It belonged to people who had lost everything and intended to keep what little remained. "Bring the horse to the trough," he said. "You look like you could use some water yourself." Lucia nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement, and led her horse through the gate. As she passed him, Ezra noticed the way she held her body, stiff, guarded, as if she expected a blow to come from the blind side. He walked with her to the corral, Pike in 2 of the other hands. A young kid named Toby and an older drifter called Dutch were watching. They stopped their work, leaning on the fence rails with smirks plastering their faces. "Well now," Pike called out, "the boss brought home a stray." Ezra ignored him. He pointed to the water trough. Lucia let her horse drink first, checking the animal's legs with gentle, capable hands before she cupped water for herself. She drank quickly, wiping her mouth with her sleeve. "You say you are a trainer," Ezra said, leaning against the corral post. "Where did you work before?" "South," she said vaguely. "Near the border." "Why did you leave?" The question hung in the heavy air. Lucia stiffened. She turned to face him, and as she did, the oversized shirt shifted at the neckline. For a fleeting second, the fabric pulled away from her collarbone. Ezra saw it clearly. It was a web of scar tissue, thick and raised, running from the base of her neck down toward her shoulder. It was not an accidental scar. It was the mark of a whip or a heated iron, an old brutality that had healed ugly and hard. His eyes widened slightly. He had seen men branded and whipped in the war, but seeing such violence mapped onto the skin of a woman struck him with a sudden, cold nausea. He stared, trying to understand the geometry of the pain. Lucia saw his gaze. Her hand flew up, pulling the collar of her shirt tight. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, terrifying mixture of shame and fury. "Don't look there." The command was low, but it cut through the heat like a knife. It was not a plea, it was a warning. Ezra looked up, meeting her eyes. The silence that stretched between them was absolute. Pike and the others were too far away to hear the words, but they saw the tension. Ezra did not apologize. Words were cheap, and in his experience, apologies were usually lies wrapped in polite phrasing. Instead, he took a half step back, physically giving her space. He lowered his gaze to the dust at her boots, then back to her face. Keeping his eyes strictly on hers, he showed her, through the restraint of his posture, that he would not cross that line again. "We have a bunk in the tack room at the end of the supply barn," Ezra said, his voice even. It is separate from the main bunkhouse. It has a heavy door and a bolt on the inside. You will be the only one with a key." Lucia watched him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She seemed to be weighing his offer against the memory of whatever had caused the scars. She looked at the heavy bolt he described, visualizing the safety it promised. "The pay is $20 a month and board." Ezra continued, "If you can do the work. If you cannot, you move on." Lucia slowly lowered her hand from her collar. The fury in her eyes settled back into that hard, guarded pragmatism. "I can do the work," she said. "Get settled." Ezra said, "We start at 5 o'clock." As she led her horse toward the supply barn, Ezra watched her go. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a recognition of something he had not seen in a long time. He knew what it was like to build a fortress around a wound. The next morning, the sky was a pale, washed-out yellow. The heat had not yet set in, but the air was already dry enough to crack a man's lips. The entire crew had gathered at the breaking pen. Word had spread that the new hire was going to try and ride the Baron. The Baron was a sorrel gelding that Ezra had bought cheap from a drover 2 months ago. The horse was big, fast, and mean. He had thrown Pike twice and had stepped on Dutch's foot with enough force to break a toe. Ezra stood by the fence, drinking coffee from a tin cup. Pike was grinning, leaning on the rails with a confidence born of cruelty. $5 says she does not last 10 seconds, Pike said to Dutch. Dutch laughed. "I will not take that bet. I give her 5 seconds before she is in the dirt." Lucia walked into the pen carrying nothing but a lead rope. She had tied her hair back with a leather thong, and she wore a pair of worn chaps she must have pulled from her saddlebag. She moved differently than the men. She did not stomp or shout. She flowed into the space, making herself small, non-threatening. The Baron snorted and pinned his ears back, turning his hindquarters toward her, a clear threat that he was ready to kick. Lucia stopped. She stood perfectly still in the center of the pen. She did not look the horse in the eye. She looked at his shoulder, projecting a calm that seemed to radiate outward. She waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. "What is she doing?" Pike muttered. "She is going to get herself killed standing there." "Quiet," Ezra said softly. Lucia began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic sound, barely audible. She took a step sideways, moving in a slow arc. The horse watched her, his ears flickering. He was confused. He expected the rope, the shout, the whip. He did not know what to do with his quiet presence. She spent 20 minutes just working her way to his shoulder. When she finally touched him, the horse shuddered, his muscles bunching to explode. Lucia did not pull away. She kept her hand flat on his neck, her touch firm but heavy, grounding him. "Easy," she murmured. I know they hurt you." With a fluidity that made Ezra blink, she slipped the lid rope over the horse's neck and vaulted onto his back. She had no saddle. The Baron exploded. He bucked with a violence that sent dust clouding into the air. He twisted in mid-air, slamming his hooves down with bone-jarring force. The men on the fence cheered and hollered, waiting for the woman to fly through the air. But Lucia did not fly. She moved. She was not fighting the horse. She was riding the storm. Her body was loose, absorbing the shocks. Her legs clamped tight around the barrel. She anticipated every twist, leaning into the turns, her hands tangled in the mane. She was not dominating the animal. She was enduring with him. The gelding bucked until his coat was frothed with white sweat. He kicked and spun, but the burden on his back would not leave. Finally, after what felt like an hour, but was likely only 5 minutes, the horse stopped. He stood in the center of the pen, sides heaving, head dropping low. Lucia sat there for a moment, breathing hard, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She patted the horse's neck, a slow, rhythmic stroke. "Good boy," she whispered. She slid off the horse, her legs shaking slightly as they hit the ground. She did not look at the men. She began to walk the horse around the pen to cool him down. Silence hung over the corral. The mockery had died in Pike's throat. Ezra felt a slow smile tug at the corner of his mouth. He finished his coffee and tossed the dregs onto the ground. "Pay the lady her respect, boys," Ezra said. Pike spat on the ground. His face had gone sour. "It is a trick," he grunted. "Some Mexican witch trick. She probably put a spell on the beast. We do not need her kind here. She will bring bad luck. A woman like that, wandering alone. She is probably a whore who ran out of customers." The air in the corral dropped 10 degrees. Ezra pushed off the fence. He moved with a speed that belied his age. In 3 strides, he was in front of Pike. He did not raise his voice, and he did not raise his fist. He simply stepped into Pike's personal space, his blue eyes hard as flint. "You are done talking," Ezra said. Pike blinked, surprised by the intensity. "I was just saying, you were just leaving." Ezra cut him off. "But you are staying to work, and while you are on my land, drawing my pay, you will keep a civil tongue. Lucia Reyes works for me. She is a hand on this ranch. If you speak to her with disrespect, you are speaking to me." And Pike, the foreman, looked at Ezra, seeing the line that had been drawn in the dirt. "Yeah, I am not the one you want to fight today." Ezra held his gaze until Pike looked away, muttering something under his breath and heading toward the barn. Ezra turned back to the pen. Lucia was still walking the horse, but she was watching him. She had heard. He gave her a single, curt nod. It was not a smile. It was an acknowledgement of the contract between them. She worked, he paid, and on his land, there was order. She returned the nod, her expression unreadable, and went back to the horse. The sun began to bleed out of the sky, turning the horizon a bruised purple. The day's work was done. The horses were fed, the tools put away. The ranch settled into the uneasy quiet of the evening. Ezra sat on his porch, lighting a pipe. The tobacco smoke drifted up, mixing with the smell of sagebrush. He felt the fatigue in his bones, but it was a good tired tonight. The gelding was broken. The ranch had moved forward, if only by an inch. Down by the supply barn, a faint light flickered in the window of the tack room. Lucia was there, safe behind her bolted door. Ezra wondered what she was doing. Was she tending to her scars? Was she sitting in the dark, listening to the coyotes, waiting for the world to try and break down the door? He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness that surprised him. It was dangerous to care about broken things in this country. They usually stayed broken far above the ranch, on the ridge of the limestone mesa that overlooked the valley. 2 riders sat on their horses. They were silhouettes against the dying light, motionless as statues. One of them lowered a brass spyglass. He was a thin man in a long duster coat, wearing a hat with a snakeskin band. "He worked for the syndicate. He worked for Silas Crow. The ranch looks weak," the man said, his voice scratching like dry leaves. "The fences are sagging in the south section. The herd is thin." "What about the woman?" the second rider asked. He was younger, with a face that looked half-finished. The man with the spyglass spat. "A stray bitch. Holt is desperate if he is hiring skirts to break his ponies." He looked down at the ranch house, at the small figure of Ezra Holt sitting on the porch, and then at the faint light in the tack room. "Mr. Crow will be interested," the man said. "Holt has a soft spot. He is taking in strays, and strays are easy to hurt." He turned his horse, the leather of his saddle creaking in the silence. "Let us go. We have seen enough." The 2 riders turned their mounts and disappeared down the backside of the mesa, leaving the Broken Creek Ranch alone in the deepening dark. But the darkness was no longer empty. It was watching. The weeks that followed Lucia Reyes's arrival at the Broken Creek Ranch were measured not in hours, but in the slow, steady improvement of the livestock. The ranch was bleeding money, and Ezra Holt had none to spare for a veterinarian or new mounts. Lucia became the stopgap. She moved through the stables with a pouch of herbs she gathered from the riverbanks and a knowledge of anatomy that seemed to sit in her fingertips. She saved a quarter-horse mare with a severe wire cut that Pike had wanted to shoot. She lanced the infection, packed the wound with a poultice of sage and honey, and spent 3 nights sleeping in the stall to keep the flies away. When the mare walked soundly 2 weeks later, Ezra calculated the value of the animal against the cost of a bullet. Lucia had saved him $40 in a single week. She worked the herd. 2. She noticed which calves were lagging before the men did. She spotted the early signs of pink eye in the steers and isolated them before it could spread. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible, but the results were loud enough to echo in the ledger books Ezra reviewed by lamplight. But while the ranch found a fragile rhythm, the land turned against them. The dry season arrived a month early, and it arrived with a vengeance. The sky bleached out to a color like old bone. The wind picked up, stripping the moisture from the soil and leaving behind a fine, powdery dust that coated everything. The creek, usually a reliable ribbon of silver, narrowed to a muddy trickle. With the drought came the predators. The wolves, desperate and thirsty, pressed closer to the ranch buildings at night. Their howling became the soundtrack to the men's sleep, a hungry chorus that set the dogs to barking and the horses to pacing in their stalls. Ezra doubled the night watch. He rode the perimeter himself most evenings, his eyes stinging from the grit in the air. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, late in August, that the horizon disappeared. Ezra was 3 miles out on the North Range, checking a windmill with Lucia. They were tightening the bolts on the vane when the wind suddenly died. The silence was absolute and terrifying. Then, the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat. Ezra looked north. A wall of darkness, towering 1,000 feet high, was rolling across the plain. It looked solid, like a moving mountain range of brown and black earth. Dust storm, Ezra said. It was not a question. Lucia was already moving toward her horse. "We need to get the stragglers into the box canyon," she said, swinging into the saddle. "If they stay in the open, they will suffocate." They rode hard. The storm did not creep. It sprinted. The sky turned a bruised purple, then black, by the time they rounded up the 20 head of cattle grazing near the canyon mouth. The first wave of sand hit them like buckshot. "Get them in!" Ezra shouted over the roar of the wind. They drove the cattle into the shelter of the canyon walls just as the sun was blotted out completely. The world reduced to a swirling vortex of choking dust. Visibility dropped to the length of a horse's neck. "We cannot make it back to the house," Ezra yelled. The wind was screaming now, a physical force that tried to tear them from their saddles. "We have to make for the line shack. It is 1/2 mile east." They rode knee to knee to keep from losing each other. The horses fought the wind, heads down, trusting the riders blindly. When the dark shape of the line shack loomed out of the brown fog, it looked like a tombstone. They stabled the horses in the lean-to shed, blocking the gaps in the wood with saddle blankets to keep the animals from inhaling too much dust. Then they shoved their way into the shack, forcing the heavy doors shut against the gale. The sudden silence inside was deafening. The shack was a 12 by 12 box of rough timber, smelling of old pine pitch and trapped heat. It was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. Ezra coughed, wiping a layer of silt from his eyes. He found the lantern and lit it. The flame sputtered, casting long, jumping shadows against the walls. "There is water in the barrel," he said. Lucia stood by the door, brushing the dust from her sleeves. She looked small in the gloom, but her posture remained rigid. "It will last all night," she said, listening to the wind hammer the roof. Ezra nodded. He checked the supplies. There was a tin of beans, some dried beef, and a single wool blanket folded on the narrow cot in the corner. It was a setup for one man, not two. They sat on the floor, opposite each other, the lantern between them. The storm outside erased the rest of the world, leaving them suspended in a space that felt both intimate and dangerous. They passed the canteen back and forth. Ezra watched her drink. She took small sips, conserving the water by instinct. "You ride well," Ezra said. "Better than Pike." Lucia lowered the canteen. "That is not a high bar to clear." Ezra huffed a laugh. "A dry sound." "No, it is not." He leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. The exhaustion of the last few months seemed to catch up with him in the stillness. "My wife used to love storms," he said. The words came out before he could stop them. He had not spoken of Clara to anyone in 2 years. She said they scrubbed the world clean. She would sit on the porch and watch the lightning until I dragged her inside. Lucia watched him. She did not offer a platitude. She waited. She died in the quiet. Ezra continued, opening his eyes and staring at the lantern flame. It was the fever. It took her voice first, then her strength. I was sick too. We were in the same bed. I held her hand. I remember thinking that if I just held on tight enough, neither of us would go, or both of us would. He looked at his hands, large and scarred. I woke up 3 days later. The fever had broken in me. She was cold. I have never understood the arithmetic of it, why the fever burned out in me and burned through her. It feels like a mistake. Lucia was silent for a long time. The wind howled outside, rattling the door on its hinges. It is not arithmetic, she said softly. It is just luck. And usually, it is bad luck. Ezra looked at her. He saw the way she held her own arm, the place where the sleeve covered the scars he had seen that first day. You have had your share, he said. Lucia looked away, toward the shuttered window. My father had a deed, she said. It was a Spanish grant, older than the territory. We had sheep. We had a valley that stayed green even in August. She traced a pattern in the dust on the floorboards with her finger. A man came from the east. He had friends in the court. He produced a new paper that said our boundaries were wrong. He said we were squatting on his land. When my father refused to leave, the sheriff came, but he did not come as a sheriff. He came with 20 men who were not deputies. She stopped moving her finger. They used the law as a shield, she said, her voice devoid of emotion, which made the story worse. They said we resisted arrest. They burned the house to flush us out. My father died in the doorway. My brothers were shot running for the trees. I was kept for a while, to be taught a lesson about where I belonged. The silence in the shack became heavy, charged with the weight of her confession. Ezra felt a cold fury rising in his chest, a familiar anger at the way the powerful devoured the weak in this country. But he knew Lucia did not want his anger, and she certainly did not want his pity. Pity was a luxury for people who were safe. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I cannot fix the world, Lucia, he said, and I cannot bring back what was stolen. He met her eyes. The lantern light caught the sharp angles of her face, the defiance that lay beneath the trauma. But on this ranch, the law is what I say it is, and I say you earn your place here. I promise you fairness. Nothing more, because I cannot guarantee safety, but you will have fairness. Lucia looked at him. She was searching for the lie, the hidden hook in the bait. She found none. Fairness is enough, she said. The night deepened, and the temperature inside the shack dropped rapidly. The desert cold was penetrating. Ezra stood up and took the single wool blanket from the cot. He hesitated, then shook it out. It is freezing, he said. We have to share it. Lucia stiffened, but she nodded. It was a practical necessity. They sat on the floor, backs against the wall. The blanket draped over both of them. They did not touch, but the space between them was filled with the heat of their bodies. Ezra could smell the scent of her. Horses, sage, and something uniquely hers, like rain on dry earth. He was acutely aware of her breathing. Every time she shifted, the movement sent a jolt through him. He had been lonely for a very long time, but this was not just loneliness. It was a recognition. He looked at her profile in the dim light and saw a strength that matched his own. He wanted to reach out and take her hand, not to possess, but to anchor, but he kept his hands on his own knees. Lucia stared straight ahead, but her breathing was shallow. She was terrified of the closeness, yet she did not pull away. For the first time in years, the proximity of a man did not mean pain. It meant warmth. They slept fitfully, drifting in and out of awareness, guarded even in their dreams. The storm broke by morning. The sun rose on a landscape that had been reshaped. Drifts of sand piled against the barn walls, and the air was crisp and clear. Life on the ranch resumed. But the dynamic had shifted. It was in the small things. When they worked the corral, Ezra would catch Lucia's eye before making a decision, seeking her nod. When they passed a water bag back and forth, their fingers would brush. and neither would pull away as quickly as before. The men noticed. Pike watched them with narrowed eyes, whispering to the new hands Ezra had hired, men with shifting gazes and no history. 2 weeks after the storm, supplies ran low. Ezra was needed at the branding chute, so Lucia harnessed the buckboard to go into town. "I will be back by noon," she told Ezra. "Be careful," he said. He did not say, "Don't go." He respected her competence too much for that. Lucia drove the wagon into the settlement of Agate Creek. It was a dusty collection of false front buildings and a church that seemed to judge the sinners from its hilltop. She tied the team at the rail outside the mercantile and walked in. The bell above the door chimed. The store smelled of coffee beans and leather. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, was behind the counter. He was a balding man who smiled too much at the wives of the wealthy and not at all at anyone else. "I need 50 pounds of flour," Lucia said, placing a list on the counter, "and a keg of nails." Gable did not look at the list. He looked at Lucia, then past her, as if checking for an owner. "We are out of flour," he said flatly. Lucia looked at the sacks stacked clearly behind him. "I can see the flour, Mr. Gable. That is reserved," he said, "for customers. I have money." Gable leaned over the counter. His face was flushed with the petty power of a small man. "We do not serve your kind here," he hissed. "You Mexicans bring trouble, and I hear you are living out at the Holt place, a woman alone with a widower. We know what you are. I will not have my decent customers subjected to it." Lucia stood rigid. The shame burned her cheeks, hot and familiar. She reached for her list to tear it up and leave, but the bell above the door chimed again. Ezra walked in. He had ridden hard to catch up to the wagon, driven by a bad feeling he couldn't shake. He stood in the doorway, dusting his hat against his leg. The atmosphere in the store evaporated. "Is there a problem?" Ezra asked. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Gable swallowed. "Mr. Holt, I was just telling the lady that we are short on stock." Ezra walked to the counter. He placed his heavy revolver on the wood. Not threateningly, but simply to adjust his belt. The sound of the steel on the counter was very loud. "I see plenty of stock," Ezra said. He looked at Gable. "Load the wagon. Everything on the list." Gable stammered. "Ezra, you know how people talk. Silas Crow. He says that—" "I do not care what Silas Crow says." Ezra interrupted. "And I do not care what you think. This woman manages my ranch. Her money is my money. Her business is my business. If you refuse her, you refuse me. And I spend a lot of money here. Gable." Gable went pale. He looked from Ezra to Lucia, then hurriedly began to stack the flour on the counter. I will put it on your bill. Mr. Holt." Ezra turned to Lucia. He did not touch her, but he stood between her and the shopkeeper. A human shield. "Wait in the wagon," he said gently. "I will handle the loading." Lucia walked out, her head high, but her hands were trembling. Ezra had claimed her, not as a possession, but as an ally. In the eyes of the town, however, he had done something far more scandalous. He had placed a Mexican woman on the same level as a white landowner. As they rode out of town, the whispers followed them like dust devils. The retaliation began 3 days later. It started small. Ezra found the north gate swinging open in the wind. The chain had not broken. It had been cut. 50 head of cattle had mixed with the scrub herd on the open range, costing the men 2 days of hard riding to sort them back out. Then the water line from the windmill to the main tank was smashed. It had been taken apart with a wrench, and the pipe bent beyond repair. The tension in the bunkhouse snapped. Pike stood in the center of the room, holding a tin plate of stew. "It is her," he announced loudly. The bad luck started when she walked in. Now Crow is squeezing us because the boss is playing house with a greaser. Toby, the young hand, looked up. "She works harder than you, Pike." Pike kicked Toby's chair, sending the boy sprawling. "Shut your mouth. You want to die for $30 a month? Crow's men said they are going to burn us out if Holt doesn't get wise." Ezra entered the bunkhouse. The silence that fell was sudden and guilty. He looked at Toby on the floor, then at Pike. "If you have something to say, Pike, say it to me." Pike threw his plate into the wash bucket. "I'm saying what every man here is thinking. We are being targeted, and we know why. You need to cut her loose. Ezra, before the roof comes down on all of us." Ezra looked around the room. He saw the division clearly. Pike and 3 others were standing together, arms crossed. Toby, Dutch, and an old-timer named Cal stood apart, looking uncomfortable but not mutinous. "Anyone who is afraid can draw their time," Ezra said. "I will pay you for the full month, but if you stay, you take orders from me, and you take orders from Lucia when I am not here." Pike spat on the floor. "I am not taking orders from a skirt. Keep your money. I am riding for Crow. He pays for loyalty." Pike grabbed his gear and stormed out. 2 others followed him. The bunkhouse felt emptier, but the air was cleaner. Ezra walked out into the night to check the barn. He found Lucia standing by the main doors. She was holding a piece of paper. This was pinned to the wood with a knife. She said, Ezra took the note. The handwriting was jagged. "Get rid of the stray or lose the herd. Last warning." Ezra crumbled the paper in his fist. He looked out at the dark horizon. He realized then that Crow was not just trying to steal land anymore. This was specific. Crow had identified the one thing Ezra had found that made him feel alive again, and he was using it as a leverage point. "He wants me to choose," Ezra said, his voice low and dangerous. "He thinks that if he squeezes hard enough, I will throw you to the wolves to save the land." He turned to look at Lucia. The moonlight caught the silver concho on her hat. "He does not know me very well." Lucia looked at the crumpled note in his hand. "He knows you better than you think." She said, "He knows you are a practical man, and practical men do not trade a ranch for a horse trainer." Ezra stepped closer. The space between them seemed to vibrate. "I am done being practical," he said. He turned and walked toward the house to clean his rifle. The war had arrived, and he had just chosen his side. Lucia watched him go, fear and hope warring in her heart. She knew what it cost to stand against the world. She just wasn't sure if Ezra Holt was ready to pay the price. September brought attention to the Broken Creek Ranch that was tighter than a new fence wire. The heat of August had broken, replaced by a restless wind that rattled the shutters and stirred the dust into stinging clouds. Ezra Holt did not sleep much anymore. He spent his nights walking the perimeter of the homestead or sitting in the dark of the main house, watching the shadows stretch across the floorboards. The ranch had become a military outpost since Pike and the dissenters had left. The crew was smaller, but it was solid. Dutch, Toby, and the old-timer Cal remained, and they looked to Ezra for survival. But increasingly, they looked to Lucia Reyes for the day-to-day orders that kept the operation breathing. Ezra had made it official during the Monday morning briefing. He stood on the porch steps, Lucia standing a few feet to his left, not behind him. "From now on," Ezra had said, his voice carrying over the wind, "Lucia manages the horse rotations and the night watch schedules. If she tells you to ride the south line, you ride the south line. If she tells you a horse is unfit for work, you turn it out." There had been a moment of silence, the kind that usually preceded a fight. But Dutch had simply nodded, shifting his tobacco from one cheek to the other. "Understood. Boss." Dutch had said, "She knows the animals better than we do anyway." It was a victory, but a quiet one. Lucia took the responsibility with the same grim pragmatism she applied to everything else. She organized the patrols in shifting patterns so that Crow's scouts, who still watched from the mesa ridges, could not predict their movements. She slept in her clothes, her boots by the door of the tack room, a rifle leaning against the wall. But while the ranch solidified from within, the pressure from the outside shifted its shape. It was no longer just about cut fences and fouled water. It became moral. On a Thursday afternoon, a buggy painted a solemn black rolled through the ranch gate. The horse pulling it was well fed, a stark contrast to the rib-thin cattle on the surrounding range. The driver was Reverend Josiah Sterling, the preacher from Agate Creek. He was a man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that judged the world and found it wanting. Ezra met him in the yard. He did not invite the man down from the buggy. "Reverend," Ezra said, holding the bridle of the preacher's horse to keep it steady, "you are a long way from the pulpit." "I go where the Lord sends me." "Ezra," Sterling said. His voice was thin and reedy. "And lately, the spirit has been heavy with concern for this valley." Ezra waited. He knew this was not a social call. "There is talk." "Ezra," the preacher continued, leaning forward, "ugly talk about the arrangement out here. A Christian man living alone with a woman of a different nature. Without the sanctity of marriage, it casts a shadow on the community. It invites moral ruin." Ezra tightened his grip on the bridle. The horse tossed its head. "She is my employee." "Reverend, she lives in the barn. I live in the house. Proximity breeds sin," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And her kind. They are not like us. They carry a different blood, a hotter blood. The town elders are concerned. Mayor Higgins, Mr. Crow, myself. We worry for your soul, Ezra, and for the reputation of the territory. For order's sake, you should send her away." Ezra looked at the man. He saw the hypocrisy etched into every line of Sterling's face. He knew that Silas Crow sat in the front pew of Sterling's church every Sunday, putting $10 gold pieces into the collection plate. "You tell Mr. Crow," Ezra said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in his chest, "that my soul is my own business. And you tell the town elders that if they are so concerned about sin, they should look at the theft and arson happening on my land before they look at who breaks my horses." Sterling straightened up, his face reddening. "Pride goeth before destruction. Ezra, you are isolating yourself. When the judgment comes, you will stand alone." "I have stood alone before," Ezra said. "Now get off my land." He slapped the horse's flank. The buggy jerked forward, turning sharply and rattling back toward the gate. Ezra watched it go, the taste of bile in his throat. He turned to find Lucia standing in the shadow of the barn door. She had heard. She always heard. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and unreadable. She vanished into the barn before he could speak. That evening, Ezra found her in the tack room. She was not sleeping. She was packing. Her small canvas bag was open on the cot, and she was folding her 2 spare shirts with precise, mechanical movements. Ezra stood in the doorway, blocking the light. "What are you doing?" he asked. Lucia did not look up. "I'm saving you the trouble," she said. "The preacher is right about one thing. I am a target. And as long as I am here, you are a target too. You are not leaving," Ezra said. Lucia slammed a shirt into the bag. She spun around, her composure cracking. "Do you think I cannot hear them?" she demanded. Her voice rose, sharp and jagged. "They call me a whore in the street. Now they come to your home and tell you I am a stain on your soul. I have lived through this before. Ezra, I know how it ends. They will burn this place down to get to me. I will not let you lose your father's land for a hired hand." She moved to push past him, but Ezra caught her arm. It was the first time he had grabbed her in anger, and he released her instantly, holding his hands up. "Stop," he said. Lucia backed against the saddle rack, her chest heaving. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you doing this? It is bad business. It is bad survival." Ezra looked at her. The room was dim, smelling of leather and oil. He saw the fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. She was trying to protect him by disappearing, because before you walked through that gate, I was already dead, Ezra said. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Lucia stopped moving. Ezra took a step closer. He did not touch her, but he leaned in, forcing her to see the truth in his face. "I was a ghost. Lucia, I woke up every morning and did the work because I did not know how to stop. But I was not here. I was buried in the ground with Clara. I had forgotten what it felt like to fight for something. I had forgotten what it felt like to look at the horizon and see a future instead of just another day to endure." He lowered his voice. "You woke me up. You made me remember that dignity is worth fighting for, that I am worth fighting for. If you leave now, you take the fight with you. and I will go back to being a ghost. Is that what you want?" Lucia stared at him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the pity she hated, but finding only a raw, terrifying honesty. She saw a man who was not saving her, but who was admitting that she had saved him. "I do not want to be the reason you are ruined," she whispered. "You are the reason I am standing," Ezra said. He stepped back, giving her the space she needed. "Unpack your bag. Lucia, we have cattle to move tomorrow." She did not answer, but she did not pick up the bag. She stood there, trembling slightly, as the walls she had built around herself developed a hairline fracture. 2 days later, the weather turned violently. A storm in the high country sent a flash flood tearing down the Pecos River. The water rose 4 feet in 2 hours, turning the lazy current into a brown, churning muscular force that ate away at the banks. Ezra and Lucia were 5 miles out, moving a group of 30 steers and calves from the low pasture to the high ground before the water could cut them off. The sky was a slate gray, spitting a cold, miserable rain that soaked through their dusters and chilled them to the bone. The river crossing was usually shallow, a gravel bar that barely wet a horse's fetlocks. Now, it was a swirling rapid. "We have to cross them here," Ezra shouted over the roar of the water. "If we wait, the water will be too high to ford, and they will be trapped on this island." Lucia nodded. She rode her mare, a tough roan, into the flank of the herd, whistling sharply. "Hiya, move up!" They drove the cattle into the water. The steers balked, eyes rolling. But Ezra and Lucia pressed them. The water hit the horses' chests, cold and powerful. The current pulled at them, trying to drag them downstream. Halfway across, a calf lost its footing. It bawled, its head going under as the current swept it toward a tangle of driftwood and dead trees. Ezra saw it, but he was on the wrong side of the herd, blocked by a wall of panicked beef. "I have it!" Lucia yelled. She turned her roan downstream, plunging into the deeper channel. The water rose to her saddle. The horse swam, head high, straining against the river. Lucia leaned far out of the saddle, grabbing the calf by the tail just as it was about to be smashed against a log. She hauled it sideways, guiding it back toward the shallows. Her horse stumbled on the hidden rocks, going to its knees. For a second, Lucia vanished under the brown water. "Lucia!" Ezra screamed, a sound that tore from his throat like a physical wound. She surfaced, coughing, still gripping the reins, and pulled the horse up. They scrambled up the muddy bank, the calf scrambling with them. Ezra spurred his horse through the rest of the ford, ignoring the water that surged over his boots. He reached the bank and vaulted off his saddle before the horse had even stopped. Lucia had slid from her mount and was on her hands and knees in the mud, retching up river water. Her hat was gone, her hair plastered to her skull, her clothes heavy and sodden. Ezra dropped to his knees beside her. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip hard, desperate. "Are you hurt? Look at me. Are you hurt?" Lucia looked up. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with adrenaline. She was shaking violently, not just from the cold, but from the brush with death. I am whole," she gasped. Ezra did not let go. He looked at her face, streaked with mud and rain, and he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked the wind out of him. It was terror and relief and a hunger that had been starving in him for years. He dragged her against him. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a collision. He buried his face in the wet curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of river and skin. "Don't you ever do that?" he growled against her skin. "Don't you dare die on me!" Lucia froze for a second. Then her hands clutched at the back of his coat. She pulled him closer, a desperate, clawing need to feel the heat of him, to prove that they were both still alive in this unforgiving world. They pulled back just enough to look at each other. The rain hammered down around them, isolating them in a curtain of gray. Ezra's eyes were dark, intense, stripped of all the rancher's discipline. He kissed her. It was not a sweet kiss. It was volatile. It tasted of rain and adrenaline and fear. It was the kiss of two people who had been walking on the edge of a cliff and had finally decided to jump. Ezra's mouth was hard on hers, demanding, and Lucia met him with a ferocity that matched his own. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling him down. For a moment, there was nothing but the sensation of contact, the fire that ignited despite the cold rain. It was a claiming, a chaotic merging of two lonely lives. Then, reality rushed back in. Lucia gasped and shoved him away. She scrambled backward in the mud, her chest heaving. She looked at him with wild eyes, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "No," she said. The word was a fracture in the moment. Ezra stayed where he was, on his knees, his hands hovering in the empty air where she had been. He breathed heavily, waiting for his heart to slow down. Lucia stood up, her legs unsteady. She wrapped her arms around herself. Shivering, "I cannot," she said, her voice trembling. "I cannot be this. I cannot be another thing you own. Ezra, I cannot be your comfort. If I give you this, if I give you that part of me, I have nothing left for myself, and when you are done with me, or when the town forces you to choose, I will be empty." She was terrified. Not of him, but of the loss of control. Desire was a trap she had learned to avoid. Ezra slowly stood up. He wiped the rain from his face. He saw her fear, and he respected it more than his own want. "I am not buying, Lucia," he said quietly, "and I am not taking—" He took a step back, showing her his empty hands. "I am not the men from your past. I do not want you to surrender. I want you to stand beside me, but I will never claim what you do not freely offer. If this is a no, then it is a no." Lucia looked at him, the rain dripping from her nose. She saw the restraint costing him, the way his jaw muscles worked. He was a man of his word, even when it hurt. "It is not a no," she whispered, so low he almost didn't hear it over the river. "It is. Not yet. I need to know I am safe. I need to know I am free." Ezra nodded. He picked up her reins and held them out to her. "Fair enough," he said. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the air between them charged with the electricity of what had happened, and what had almost happened. The truce with the world did not last the week. On Saturday, Lucia had to go to Agate Creek to pick up a special order of liniment for the horses that the stagecoach had brought in. Ezra offered to go, but he was deep in negotiations with a cattle buyer from Texas who had braved the trip out to the ranch. "I will be fine," Lucia had said. "I will go in, get the box, and come out. I will not speak to anyone." She took the buckboard. The ride was uneventful until she reached the edge of town. The atmosphere was different today. There were more men on the porches, watching. She tied the horses in front of the freight office. She went inside, signed for the package, and walked out with the box under her arm. She kept her head down, her eyes on the ground. She was 10 feet from the wagon when a shadow blocked her path. "Hold it right there," a voice said. It was Deputy Vance. He was a thick-necked man who owed his badge to Silas Crow's influence. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, grinning. "We have had a report of a theft," Vance said loudly. "A silver pocket watch, stolen from Mr. Gable's store about 20 minutes ago." "I have not been to the store," Lucia said, her voice steady. "I went to the freight office. Asked the clerk." Vance stepped closer. A crowd began to gather. Men spilled out of the saloon, sensing sport. "We do not need to ask anyone," Vance said. "We know how your kind operates. Sneaky." Light-fingered. "Let us see what is in the box." "It is horse liniment." Lucia said. "Let me see," Vance shouted, slapping the box from her hand. It hit the dust. A bottle shattered, leaking dark, pungent fluid into the dirt. Vance didn't look at it. He grabbed Lucia's arm. Resisting an officer, he announced to the crowd, "And suspected theft. You are coming with me. I did not steal anything," Lucia cried out, struggling as he twisted her arm behind her back. The pain in her shoulder, near the old scars, was blinding. "Don't you talk back to me," Vance snarled. He dragged her through the street. The crowd parted, jeering. Someone threw a clump of mud that hit her cheek. "Lock her up," a man shouted. "Teach her a lesson." Vance hauled her to the jailhouse and shoved her into the single iron-barred cell at the back. He didn't lock the outer door. He wanted the town to see. He wanted her to be a spectacle. "Sit there and think about your sins," Vance said, spitting on the floor outside the cell. Lucia sat on the narrow cot, holding her bruised arm. She did not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She stared at the wall, her face a mask of stone, while the town gawked at her through the window and the open door. She sat there for 3 hours. Then, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the afternoon quiet. It was not the trot of a carriage horse. It was the thunder of a stallion being ridden at a dead run. Ezra Holt tore into town on his black gelding. He pulled the horse up so hard it slid on its haunches, dust billowing in a cloud. He did not tie the horse. He threw the reins over the rail and stormed up the steps of the jailhouse. He kicked the door open. The wood splintered against the wall. Vance jumped up from his desk, his hand going for his gun. "Do not!" Ezra roared. The command was so forceful that Vance froze. Ezra walked to the desk. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He slammed it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud of gold and silver. $50, Ezra said. "That is the bail limit for petty theft." "Count it," Vance stammered. "Now wait a minute. Ezra, the judge is not in. We have to hold her until—" "I said count it," Ezra yelled, leaning over the desk, "or I will take it out of your hide." Vance opened the bag with trembling fingers. He looked at the coins. It is all here." "Key," Ezra said. Vance grabbed the key ring from the wall. He walked to the cell, his hands shaking. He unlocked the door. Lucia stood up. She walked out of the cell, stepping past Vance as if he were a piece of furniture. She looked at Ezra. Her eyes were dry, but they burned with a humiliation that hurt worse than the bruising. Ezra did not speak to her yet. He turned to Vance. "I want a hearing on Monday," Ezra said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "And you better bring the man who lost the watch. And if I find out there was no watch, Vance, I will have your badge, and then I will come for you." He put his hand on Lucia's back, a protective, guiding weight. "Let us go." They walked out onto the street. A crowd had formed again. They were silent now, awed by Ezra's rage. But near the saloon, a man laughed. It was one of Crow's new enforcers, a man named Stark with a scar across his nose. That is a lot of money for a bedwarmer. "Holt," Stark called out. "Does she do tricks?" The world seemed to stop. Ezra handed Lucia the reins of his horse. "Hold this," he said softly. He walked toward Stark. Stark stood up from the bench, grinning, his hand drifting toward his knife. Ezra did not stop. He walked straight into Stark's space. When Stark reached for his knife, Ezra caught his wrist with his left hand and drove his right fist into Stark's face. The sound was like a hammer hitting a side of beef. Stark's nose crumpled. He went down hard in the dust. Ezra stood over him, breathing hard. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the shopkeepers, the churchgoers, the silent men who let this happen. "Anyone else?" Ezra asked. No one moved. Ezra turned, walked back to Lucia, and took the reins. He helped her up onto his horse, then swung up behind her. They rode out of town, leaving a silence that felt like the calm before a massacre. The sun had set by the time they reached the ranch porch. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in Ezra's hand and a heavy exhaustion in the air. Lucia brought a bowl of warm water and a strip of clean linen out to the porch where Ezra sat. His right hand was swollen, the knuckles split and bleeding. She sat on the bench beside him. She took his hand in hers. Her touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the day. "You should not have done that," she said softly, dipping the cloth in the water. "You made an enemy of the whole town." Ezra winced as the water touched the raw skin. They were already enemies. "Lucia, they just stopped pretending." He watched her work. She wrapped the linen around his hand with practiced efficiency. She was close to him, her head bent over his hand. "They wanted to break you," Ezra said. "They wanted me to see you in that cage and be ashamed." Lucia paused. She looked up at him. "Were you?" Ezra used his uninjured hand to touch her chin, tilting her face up. "I have never been prouder to know anyone," he said. "You sat in that cell, and you did not give them a single tear. You are stronger than all of them combined." Lucia's eyes filled. Finally, the tears she had held back in the jail spilled over. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest. Ezra wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the night. "This is not over," she whispered into his coat. "Crow will not stop." "I know," Ezra said, looking out at the darkness where the wolves were howling. But tonight, on the porch, with her bandaging his wounds, the fear was matched by something else, a tenderness that had taken root in the rocky soil of their lives. They were marked targets now, but they were targets who were no longer alone. Ezra looked at his bandaged hand, then at the woman resting against him. "Let them come," he thought. He kissed the top of her head. Let them come. The October wind in the New Mexico territory was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, the heat from the day, and on the night of the 12th, it tried to steal the future of the Broken Creek Ranch. It began 2 hours after midnight. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering little light. Ezra Holt was awake, sitting in his study with a ledger open, staring at columns of figures that refused to balance. The silence of the house was heavy, broken only by the scratching of a mouse in the wall. Then came the smell. It was not the comforting scent of a wood stove or the sharp tang of branding iron smoke. It was thick, oily, and sweet. Kerosene. Ezra dropped his pen. He was out of the chair and through the front door before the thought fully formed in his mind. He hit the porch, and the world turned orange. The hay barn, a massive structure of seasoned timber located 50 yards from the main house, was not just burning, it was roaring. The flames climbed the walls like living things, feeding on the dry winter feed stored inside. The heat hit Ezra's face across the yard, a physical blow that dried his eyes instantly. "Fire!" Ezra bellowed, his voice tearing through the night. "Fire in the barn!" The ranch erupted into chaos. The bunkhouse door banged open. Dutch and Toby stumbled out, pulling on their boots, their faces slack with shock as they saw the inferno. "The horses!" Ezra screamed, running toward the adjacent stable. The heat was already radiating through the wood of the stalls. If the wind shifted, the sparks would jump to the stable roof, and the animals inside would burn alive. Ezra reached the stable doors just as Lucia Reyes sprinted from the darkness. She was dressed in her nightshirt with trousers pulled hastily over them, her feet bare in her unlaced boots. Her hair was loose, flying behind her like a dark banner. "Get the halters!" she shouted. "Not waiting for orders. We have to run them to the South Corral." They worked with a desperate, terrifying synchronicity. Ezra threw open the stall doors while Lucia grabbed the terrified animals. The horses were screaming, a high-pitched human sound that chilled the blood. The air was filled with smoke and the crackle of burning timber that sounded like gunfire. Dutch and Toby joined them, wrapping shirts around the horses' eyes to blind them to the fire. "Go! Go!" Ezra yelled, slapping the rump of the big bay stallion. The horse bolted out into the yard, illuminated by the hellish light of the burning hay. The fire cast shadows that stretched 100 feet long, dancing wildly across the desert floor. The night had been turned into a cruel, flickering sunrise. Lucia was inside the stall of the new mare, the one that was prone to panic. The animal was rearing, striking out with its hooves. The stable was filling with smoke, making it hard to breathe. "Easy," Lucia commanded, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register she used for the broken ones. She ducked under a flailing hoof, risking her skull, and clamped her hand over the mare's nose, forcing the animal's head down. "Trust me." She clipped the lead rope on. Ezra watched her for a split second through the haze. The firelight caught her face, fierce and soot-streaked. She looked like a spirit forged in the flames, unafraid of the heat because she had already walked through it. She led the mare out, running alongside the animal as embers rained down like fiery snow. "We have to drop the water tank," Ezra shouted to Dutch. "Soak the stable roof or we lose the tack room too." They fought the fire for 3 hours. It was a losing battle for the hay barn. That was gone the moment the match was struck. But they fought to save the rest. They formed a bucket line from the windmill tank, drenching the walls of the stable and the main house. The heat singed the hair on their arms and blistered the paint on the siding. By the time the roof of the hay barn collapsed inward with a sound like a dying giant, sending a geyser of sparks toward the stars, the danger had passed. The stable stood. The horses were safe in the far corral, huddled together and shivering. Ezra stood in the yard, his hands resting on his knees, gasping for air. His lungs burned. His shirt was ruined, scorched and black with ash. He looked at the pile of glowing embers that used to be his winter feed. That was $500 of hay. Gone. He knew it was not an accident. The smell of kerosene had been too strong. He turned to look for his crew. Dutch and Toby were sitting by the trough, splashing water on their faces. Lucia was standing by the corral fence, checking the legs of the bay stallion. Ezra walked over to her. His boots felt heavy as lead. "Are you burned?" he asked. His voice was a wreck, raspy from the smoke. Lucia turned. Her face was black with soot, her eyes standing out in stark, white contrast. She had a burn mark on her forearm where a falling ember had landed, but she didn't seem to notice it. "I am fine," she said. "The mare has a cut on her flank, but it is shallow." Ezra looked at the burn on her arm. He reached out, taking her wrist gently. He examined the angry red mark. "You are hurt." "It is nothing," she said, pulling her hand away slowly. "It is just fire." Ezra looked back at the smoldering ruins. The anger that had fueled him during the crisis was draining away, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. "It was Crow," Ezra said. "It had to be. He burned the feed to starve us out." Lucia said. She leaned against the fence, her strength finally wavering. "If we cannot feed the stock through the winter, we have to sell." Ezra ran a hand through his soot-stained hair. "I cannot keep doing this. Lucia." The confession came out as a whisper, soft and broken. He sank down onto a crate near the fence, the fight leaving his body. "I cannot keep losing pieces of my life to men like him. First the fever took Clara, then the bank took the lower pasture. Now this, every time I build something, the world decides to tear it down. I am tired. Lucia, I am so tired of holding up the roof while the walls burn." Lucia looked at him. She saw the crack in the granite. Ezra Holt was the strongest man she had ever known, but even stone wore down under the constant dripping of water. She walked over and sat on the ground near the crate, looking up at him. "I know that kind of tired," she said. She picked up a handful of dirt and let it run through her fingers. "I told you about my father," she said, "but I did not tell you about afterward." Ezra looked at her, listening in the quiet that follows disaster. "After the fire that killed my family, I had nowhere to go. A man came to me, Don Armando. He was powerful. He owned land from the river to the mountains. He told me he had been a friend of my father. He offered me protection. He said, 'Come to my hacienda. Lucia, you will be safe there. No one will hurt you under my roof.'" Her voice was steady, but her hands were trembling slightly. "I went. I was 18. I thought he was a savior, but protection has a price." Ezra, he did not want a guest. He wanted a possession. He wanted something pretty to keep in a cage. When I tried to leave, he showed me the bill. He said I owed him for the food, for the clothes, for the air I breathed. He said if I left, his men would find me and bring me back in chains. Ezra watched her face, the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. "That is where the scars came from," she said quietly. "He liked to remind me that my skin belonged to him. He used a riding crop. He said it was discipline. He said he was teaching me gratitude." Ezra felt a sickness rise in his gut, a violent urge to kill a man he had never met. "I ran away 3 times, Lucia said. "The 3rd time, I stole a horse and rode until the horse died. Then I walked until I forgot my own name. I swore I would never again let a man hold the deed to my life. I swore I would never owe anyone for my safety." She looked directly at Ezra. "That is why I check the exits. That is why I count the money. Because powerful men do not give gifts. Ezra, they make investments, and they always collect." Ezra looked at her, really looked at her. and saw the immense courage it took for her to just stay standing in a room with a man, let alone work for one. He stood up slowly. "Wait here," he said. He walked to the main house. He went to his study, lit a fresh lamp, and opened his safe. He took out a sheet of paper and a pen. He wrote quickly, his hand steady despite the exhaustion. Then he opened the cash box and counted out $200, nearly all the liquid cash he had on hand. He returned to the corral. Lucia had not moved. Ezra handed her the paper and the stack of bills. "This is a bank draft for 6 months of wages, in advance," Ezra said. "And the cash is a bonus for saving the herd tonight." Lucia looked at the money, then at him, confusion clouding her eyes. "You are firing me." "No," Ezra said. "I am freeing you." He pointed to the paper. "That is a letter of reference. It says you are the finest horse trainer in the territory. It is signed and stamped. You can take that money, take your mare, and ride north or west. You can go to California. You can get far away from Silas Crow and his fires. You can get far away from me." He squatted down so he was eye level with her. "I am not Don Armando. Lucia, I am not a jailer. You do not owe me for the roof over your head. You earned it. You do not owe me for the protection. You earned that too. If you stay here, you are going to be in the middle of a war, and I cannot promise you will win. So I am giving you the choice. Leave now, with money in your pocket and no debt, or stay. But if you stay, it is because you choose it, not because you have nowhere else to go." Lucia held the papers. The paper rustled in the wind. She looked at the money, enough to start over, enough to be safe. She looked at the burned barn, the smell of ash choking the air. Then she looked at Ezra. She saw the soot on his face, the bloodshot eyes, and the open, honest way he offered her the door. He was giving her the one thing she had been denied for 10 years, autonomy. She slowly folded the bills and put them in her pocket. She folded the letter of reference and put it with the money. Then she stood up and brushed the dust from her trousers. "I will need coffee before we start the repairs," she said. Ezra blinked. "You're staying?" Lucia looked at the sunrise that was just beginning to bleed gray into the eastern sky. "I am not running from fire anymore. Ezra, I am tired of walking. And besides," she looked back at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, "you would make a terrible cook without me." Ezra let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. It was a long, shuddering exhale. He nodded. "I make decent biscuits." He defended weakly. "They are like rocks. Ezra." They stood there in the wreckage of the night, and for the first time, the distance between them felt like a bridge rather than a chasm. In the weeks that followed the fire, the dynamic on the Broken Creek Ranch shifted into something solid and undeniable. They rebuilt the barn wall with the salvaged timber. They moved the herd to the lower canyon where the grass was thin but safe. The relationship between Ezra and Lucia deepened, not into a passionate affair, but into a domestic partnership that was almost more dangerous because of how natural it felt. They ate their meals together at the long table in the main house. It started as a necessity, discussing ranch business, but it became a ritual. Lucia would cook a stew with peppers she grew in a pot by the door, and Ezra would slice the bread. They talked about the horses, the weather, and the price of beef, but they also talked about other things. Ezra told her about his boyhood in Ohio, about the green trees and the rivers that never ran dry. Lucia told him about the music her mother used to play on a guitar, and the way the desert smelled after the monsoons in the south. They rode the line together 3 times a week. On these rides, away from the prying eyes of the crew, they allowed themselves moments of quiet joy. One afternoon, chasing a stray calf through a dry creek bed, Ezra's hat blew off in a gust of wind. It tumbled end over end, landing in a prickly pear cactus. Ezra stared at the hat, stuck firmly among the thorns. "Well," he said dryly, "that is unfortunate." Lucia laughed. It was a clear, bright sound that startled a hawk from a mesquite bush. Ezra turned to look at her. He realized he had never heard her laugh like that. It changed her face, erasing the years of vigilance and leaving behind someone young and vibrant. He smiled, a genuine crinkling of his eyes. "You find my misfortune amusing," Miss Reyes, it is the cactus, she said, still smiling. It has good taste. It knows a good hat when it sees one. Ezra shook his head. Retrieving the hat carefully, I think it is a sign, he said. The land is telling me to buy a new one, or telling you to hold on to things tighter, she replied. The playfulness hung in the air, light and unfamiliar, in a world that seemed allergic to joy. Their laughter felt like an act of rebellion. They were two people who had been hollowed out by grief and trauma, slowly filling each other up again. But the world outside the ranch was not laughing. November brought a cold front and a delegation from the town. It was a Tuesday morning. Ezra and Lucia were in the corral, sorting the yearlings. A group of 6 riders appeared on the road. They did not look like customers. Ezra wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out of the corral. Lucia stayed by the gate, her hand resting on the latch. The riders stopped 10 yards away. At the front was Mr. Gable, the storekeep. Flanked by Deputy Vance and 4 other men Ezra recognized as loud voices in the town's saloons. They were the Citizens Committee, a polite name for a mob with a moral grievance. Ezra, halt, Gable shouted. We need to have words. Ezra walked to the center of the yard. He stood with his feet apart, his posture relaxed but ready. I'm listening, Ezra said. Gable looked nervous, but Vance looked eager. We are here to deliver a warning, Vance said, spitting into the dirt. The town is tired of the situation out here. It is unnatural. A white man living with a Mexican woman. It sends the wrong message. It is affecting business. Decent folks do not want to trade with a man who has no respect for his own race. Ezra's expression did not change. Is that so? He said. It is. Gable piped up. Silas Crow. Well, Mr. Crow and the mayor agree. For the good of the community, the woman has to go. If she is gone by sunset, the trouble stops. If she stays, well, we cannot guarantee that accidents won't happen. Like that fire. Ezra looked at the men. He saw the hatred in their eyes, the small-minded bigotry that Crow was manipulating to get his hands on the water rights. Lucia stepped forward. She opened the corral gate and walked out to stand 5 feet behind Ezra. She did not hide. She did not look down. She looked at Vance with a gaze that could cut glass. I am not going anywhere, she said clearly. Vance laughed. Look at her, acting like she belongs here. You are a stray, girl. You are just something Hope picked up to keep his bed warm until he finds a proper woman. The insult hung in the cold air. Ezra took 2 steps forward. The group of riders shifted their horses nervously. Ezra's voice dropped to a register that was terrifyingly calm. You are making a mistake, Ezra said. We are just stating facts, Vance sneered. She is a hired help, a servant. She has no standing here. Ezra looked at Vance. Then he looked at his own ranch hands. Dutch, Toby, and Cal, who had gathered by the barn, watching. He looked at Lucia. He made a decision. It was a decision that would burn the last bridge he had with the polite society of the territory. But he did not care. Lucia Reyes is not a servant, Ezra announced. His voice rang out across the yard, loud enough for every man to hear. He turned and looked at Lucia, then back at the mob. She is the forewoman of the Broken Creek Ranch. Silence slammed into the yard. A forewoman. It was unheard of. A woman giving orders to men, a Mexican woman holding authority over white hands. It was a violation of every social code the West was built on. What did you say? Gable whispered. Aghast. You heard me, Ezra said. She is my partner in this operation. Her word is my word. If she tells you to leave, you leave. If she signs a check, the bank honors it. She is not help. She is management. And she is my equal on this land. Vance's face turned a violent shade of red. You are out of your mind. Holt, you are elevating a greaser to boss? You are spitting in the face of every white man in the territory. I am spitting in your face. Vance, Ezra said. Now get off my land, before the forewoman orders the boys to open fire. Ezra gestured to the barn. Dutch and Cal had stepped forward, and in their hands, they held Winchester rifles. They were leveled at the deputation. Dutch spat a stream of tobacco juice. "You heard the boss," Dutch said. "And you heard the lady. Right on." Vance looked at the rifles, then at Ezra, and finally at Lucia. He saw something in her eyes that frightened him. The absolute lack of fear of a woman who has already survived hell. "This is not over," Vance hissed. "Crow will hear about this. You just signed your death warrant. Holt. And hers too. Turn around," Ezra said. The group wheeled their horses and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted back over the ranch. Ezra turned to Lucia. She was staring at him, her mouth slightly open. The shock was plain on her face. He had just given her a title that offered legal protection, status, and authority. He had just made her a target. Yes, but he had also made her a queen in her own domain. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. Ezra adjusted his hat. "Yes, I did, because it is the truth. You run this place as much as I do. It is time they knew it." Lucia looked at the dust settling on the road. "They will kill us for this," she said. "Maybe," Ezra replied. "But they will have to look us in the eye when they do it." In the opulent office of the syndicate headquarters in Agate Creek, Silas Crow sat behind a mahogany desk. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive suits, a predator wrapped in silk. Vance stood before him, hat in hand, recounting the events at the ranch. He called her forewoman, Mr. Crow. He said she is his equal. He had his men point guns at us. Crow listened, his fingers steepled. He did not yell. He did not throw things. He was far too dangerous for that. He smiled, a cold, mirthless expression. "His equal?" Crow repeated softly. "Yes, sir," in front of everyone. Crow stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town he effectively owned. "Ezra Holt is a fool," Crow said. "If he had just kept her as a mistress, the town would have grumbled but looked away. Men have vices. But to elevate her, to give her power, to tell the world that a Mexican woman is as good as a white man?" Crow turned back to the room. His eyes were hard as diamonds. "That is not a vice. Vance, that is a revolution. And revolutions must be crushed." He walked to his desk and opened a drawer. He pulled out a fresh stack of legal papers and a heavy box of ammunition. "He wants to play the law? We will ruin him in court. He wants to play the gunman? We will bury him in the desert." Crow looked at Vance. "Send for the regulators, the ones from Texas, the ones who do not ask questions. I want Ezra Holt bankrupt. And I want the woman—" He paused, the cruelty shining in his eyes. "I want the woman broken. I want her to wish she had stayed in the fire." Crow blew out the match he had just lit for his cigar. "Burn them down," he whispered. "Burn them all the way down." The summons arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a deputy who refused to look Ezra Holt in the eye. The paper was heavy, thick with official seals, and it smelled of the stale air of a courthouse back room. It was a writ of contest regarding the water rights of the Broken Creek Ranch, citing an obscure survey error from 1852. Ezra stood on the porch, the paper rattling in the cold November wind. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. Silas Crow was not just trying to burn them out. He was trying to erase them with ink. The writ claimed that the creek's primary access point belonged to the public domain, which the syndicate had conveniently petitioned to manage. If the judge in Agate Creek ruled on this, the ranch would be dry within a month. And the judge in Agate Creek was Judge Pemsel, a man whose gambling debts were widely known and frequently paid by men like Crow. "We cannot fight this here," Ezra said. Walking into the kitchen where Lucia was oiling a bridle, "Pemsel will bang his gavel before we even take our seats. We have to go to the county seat. We have to file a counter-petition with the district court in Silverton." Lucia looked up. She saw the grim set of his jaw. "Silverton is a 3-day ride," she said, "through the canyon country." "I know," Ezra replied. "But if we do not go, we lose the water. And if we lose the water, the cattle die." "I am coming with you," Lucia stated. It was not a question. Ezra hesitated. The road to Silverton was desolate, a winding snake of treacherous geology that offered 100 places for an ambush. But he looked at her, at the way her hands moved confidently over the leather. at the set of her shoulders, and realized that leaving her here was no safer. The ranch was a target, and she was the bullseye. "Pack a bag," Ezra said. "We leave at first light." The journey began under a sky the color of bruised iron. They took the buckboard wagon, loaded with supplies and a heavy lockbox containing every deed, tax receipt, and survey map Ezra had inherited from his father. They also took rifles. Ezra kept a Winchester across his knees, and Lucia had a smaller carbine tucked into the boot of the wagon seat. The hostility of Agate Creek was a physical weight as they rolled through town. Men stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass, their faces hard and unreadable. A woman sweeping her stoop paused and spat onto the dirt as Lucia rode by. Lucia did not flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon, her spine straight, refusing to acknowledge the insult. They made good time the first day, pushing the team hard across the flatlands before the terrain began to rise into the jagged foothills. They camped that night in a dry wash, taking turns to watch the fire. The silence of the desert was deep, but it felt brittle, as if it might snap at any moment. On the second day, the trouble started. They were navigating a narrow pass known as Devil's Elbow, where the road cut sharply between a limestone cliff and a steep drop-off into a dry riverbed. The wagon hit a rut, a common enough occurrence, but the sound that followed was wrong. It was not the groan of wood under stress. It was the sharp crack of structural failure. The rear left wheel collapsed. The wagon lurched violently, tilting toward the drop-off. Ezra shouted, hauling back on the reins to stop the team before they dragged the vehicle over the edge. The horses danced and snorted, their hooves kicking up dust near the precipice. Ezra set the brake and jumped down. He examined the wheel. The rim had separated, but when he looked closer at the spokes, his blood ran cold. They had not broken from age. They had been sawed halfway through, the cuts filled with dark grease to hide the sabotage. "They tampered with it in town," Ezra said, his voice low. "They waited until we were on the pass." A gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. A puff of dust exploded from the wagon seat, inches from Lucia's hip. "Get down!" Ezra roared. He grabbed his rifle and dove behind the body of the wagon. Lucia was already moving, sliding from the seat and scrambling for cover behind the rear axle. Another shot rang out, whining off the iron rim of the broken wheel. The shooter was high up, on the ridge line. "Do you see him?" Lucia asked, her voice tight but controlled. She had her carbine shouldered, scanning the rocks above. "No," Ezra said, working the lever of his Winchester. "He is behind the scrub oak. He is pinning us down." They were trapped. The wagon provided cover, but they were exposed on the open road with a drop-off on one side and a sniper on the other. If the shooter had friends, or if he decided to shoot the horses, they were dead. "I am going to draw his fire," Ezra said. "No," Lucia hissed. "That is suicide." Ezra looked at her. His blue eyes were fierce. "If I move to the rocks on the left, he has to track me. That gives you a shot. You're the better shot. Lucia, we both know it." He did not wait for her permission. Ezra sprinted from behind the wagon, diving toward a cluster of boulders 10 yards away. The hidden rifle cracked twice. Bullets kicked up dirt at Ezra's heels, but he made the cover. Lucia saw the flash of muzzle smoke. It came from a cleft in the limestone, 300 yards up. She rested her carbine on the wagon axle, took a breath, and let it out slowly. She did not think about the man she was trying to kill. She thought about the windage, the elevation, the mechanics of survival. She squeezed the trigger. Her carbine barked. On the ridge, a man cried out, a short, sharp sound. A rifle clattered down the cliff face, bouncing off the rocks, followed by the sound of boots scrambling away in panic. Ezra waited a full minute, scanning the ridge. Silence returned to the canyon. "He's gone," Ezra called out. "You winged him." He stood up and walked back to the wagon. He looked at the bullet hole in the wood of the seat, then at Lucia. She was lowering the rifle, her hands trembling now that the moment had passed. Ezra reached out and gripped her shoulder. It was a hard, grounding touch. "Good shooting," he said. Lucia looked at him, her eyes dark. They want us dead. Ezra, this is not about a lawsuit anymore. We fix the wheel, Ezra said, his voice grim, and we keep moving. I am not turning back. They repaired the wheel using a spare spoke and strips of rawhide. Working with frantic intensity, they drove on until the sun failed, pushing the exhausted team to reach the way station at Cross Creek before total darkness fell. The way station was a miserable structure of adobe and sod, clinging to the edge of the wilderness. The proprietor, a man with one eye and a suspicious nature, spat on the floor when they entered. One room left, he grunted. Take it or sleep with the mules. Ezra paid the man. He did not argue. The room was small, freezing, and contained a single narrow bed with a corn husk mattress. The wind howled through the cracks in the adobe. Ezra carried the lockbox inside, placing it in the corner, and barred the door. They were exhausted, covered in the dust of the road and the residue of fear. The adrenaline from the ambush was fading, leaving behind a raw, vibrating tension. Ezra poured water from a pitcher into a cracked basin. He stripped off his coat and shirt to wash the grit from his face and arms. The water was icy, but he needed the shock of it. Lucia sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. She watched the muscles in his back move as he scrubbed his skin. She saw the scars of his life, the barbed wire tear on his forearm, the burn from the branding iron, the sheer physical solidity of him. He turned, drying his face with a rough towel. He caught her watching him. The air in the room changed. It became heavy, charged with the same electricity that had been building between them for months. They were two people who had survived death that afternoon, and the proximity of the small room stripped away the polite fictions of employer and employee. Ezra tossed the towel aside. He walked toward her. He did not stop until he was standing just inches away. Lucia looked up at him. She did not retreat. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a rhythm of fear and desire that she could no longer separate. Ezra, she whispered. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently touched her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. His eyes were dark, filled with a hunger that terrified her, not because it was predatory, but because she felt it reflected in herself. We are alive, Ezra said softly. Lucia stood up. She was close enough to feel the heat of his skin. She remembered the kiss in the rain, the volatility of it. She wanted that obliteration again. She wanted to forget the sniper, the fire, and the memories of Don Armando in the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were the only truth in the world. She leaned in, her hand rising to touch his bare chest, her fingers grazing the hair over his heart. Ezra's breath hitched. He began to lower his head, his eyes closing. Then he stopped. He froze, his forehead resting against hers. He took a ragged breath and pulled back, just an inch. He took her hand, the one resting on his chest, and held it firmly, stopping its movement. No, he rasped. Not tonight. Lucia blinked, confusion and a sharp sting of rejection flashing in her eyes. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. Ezra looked at her, and the tenderness in his expression broke her heart. Because you are scared, Lucia, because we were almost killed today, and because if we do this now, in this room, with the fear still in our blood, it will be just another desperate thing, just another escape. He squeezed her hand. I want you, he said. The truth of it stark and unashamed. I want you more than I have wanted anything in 10 years, but I want you when you are not running. I want you when we are safe. I want it to be a choice, not a reaction. Lucia stared at him. She realized then that he was protecting her, even from himself. He was refusing to use her vulnerability, even when she was offering it to him. Don Armando had taken her when she was weak. Ezra Holt was waiting for her to be strong. She pulled her hand away, not in anger, but in wonder. She sat back down on the bed, wrapping her arms around herself. You are a stubborn man. Ezra Holt, I have been told, he said, a faint smile touching his lips. He grabbed the extra blanket from his bedroll and moved to the corner of the room. "Near the door." "You take the bed," he said. "I will sleep by the door." He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. But in the dark, the distance between them felt smaller than it ever had before. Silverton was a bustling mining town that served as the county seat. It was noisy, dirty, and alive with the commerce of silver and cattle. Ezra and Lucia did not waste time. They went straight to the district courthouse. They found a lawyer named Elias Abernathy. He operated out of a small office above a bakery, and his suit was threadbare, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He listened to Ezra lay out the situation, nodding as he reviewed the documents Ezra had brought. "Crow is relying on the 1852 survey," Abernathy said, lighting a pipe. "It was drawn up by a drunkard who was later indicted for fraud. I know the precedent, but proving it is the hard part. We need testimony. We have witnesses." Lucia said. She was standing by the window, watching the street. "Who?" Abernathy asked. "The families he has already broken," she said. "The Millers, the Garcias, they are here in Silverton, living in the shanties near the mine. They sold because they were terrified. If they speak, if they go on record that they were coerced, it establishes a pattern." Abernathy looked at her, impressed. "Testimony of coercion invalidates the contracts," he mused. "And if the contracts are invalid, the syndicate's claim to the water rights, which relies on possessing the adjacent land, crumbles." Ezra spent the next 3 days hunting down ghosts. He and Lucia walked through the shanty towns, finding the ranchers who had disappeared from the valley. They found Tom Miller working as a swamper in a saloon, a broken man who wept when Ezra bought him a drink. They found the Garcia widow washing clothes for miners. At first, they were afraid to speak. Crow's reach was long, but Ezra listened to them. He did not promise them their land back. He was too honest for that, but he promised them a chance to strike back. He promised them that their names would be on the record, not as victims, but as people who stood up. "We are filing the counterpetition tomorrow," Abernathy told them on the 4th day. "And I have found something else. The original land grant for your section. Ezra. It explicitly ties the water rights to the homestead, regardless of grazing boundaries." Crow's lawyers missed it because it was written in Spanish. Lucia smiled. It was a cold, satisfied smile. They did not think to read the language of the people they were stealing from. "We have a case," Abernathy said. "A strong one. But filing it is just the bell for the first round. Crow will come at you with everything he has now." "I am counting on it," Ezra said. The ride back to Agate Creek was tense, but the air felt different. They were not just surviving anymore. They were carrying a weapon. The legal papers Abernathy had filed were a shield, however fragile. They stopped at the edge of Agate Creek to water the horses before the final leg to the ranch. The town seemed quiet, but as they stood by the trough, a group of men emerged from the livery stable. Among them was a man Ezra recognized. It was Rollins, a drifter Ezra had hired 2 months ago to help with the fencing. Rollins had disappeared the day before the hay barn fire. Ezra stiffened, his hand drifting to his gun. Rollins walked toward them, flanked by 3 of Crow's regulators. He looked cleaner than he had on the ranch, wearing a new coat and a hat that cost a month's wages. "Well, look who made it back," Rollins sneered. "We heard you 2 ran off to get married, or just to share a blanket in the city." Ezra stepped forward, but Lucia put a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said. She walked toward Rollins. She did not walk like a woman afraid. She walked like a forewoman inspecting a bad job. "You look expensive." "Rollins," Lucia said, her voice carrying clearly in the street. 30 pieces of silver buys a nice coat." Rollins flushed. "Don't you talk to me, you Mexican whore. You think because you spread your legs for the boss you can give orders. You are nothing. Crow is going to crush this whole operation. And you will be back in a border brothel where you belong." A group of women had gathered outside the general store. They were the respectable wives of the town, the ones who usually looked through Lucia as if she were glass. They stopped to listen. Lucia stopped 3 feet from Rollins. "I am the woman who saved the herd you were too drunk to watch," she said calmly. "I am the woman who signs the ledgers. And I am the woman who is going to testify in a court of law that you were seen carrying kerosene the night the barn burned." Rollins blinked. "That is a lie, is it?" Lucia asked. "You seem nervous." "Rollins, did Crow tell you he would protect you, just like he protected the Millers, just like he protects everyone until he is done with them?" She turned to the crowd. She looked at the women. "My name is Lucia Reyes. I am a partner in the Broken Creek Ranch, and I do not hide behind hired guns to speak my mind." She turned back to Rollins, her eyes blazing. "Get out of my way." Rollins hesitated. He looked at his friends, but they looked uneasy. There was a power in her dignity that was hard to combat with simple insults. He stepped aside, spitting on the ground to save face, but he moved. As Lucia walked back to the wagon, she caught the eye of Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife. Mrs. Gable did not smile, but she gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was not friendship, but it was respect. Ezra helped Lucia into the wagon. "You started a fire of your own," he murmured. "Let us go home," she said. They crested the final ridge that overlooked the Broken Creek Ranch just as the sun was setting. The sky was a bruised purple, beautiful and indifferent. Ezra pulled the horses up short. "Oh God," he breathed. The main house still stood, and the stable was intact. But the main corral, the sturdy oak fencing that Ezra's father had built with his own hands 40 years ago, was destroyed. It had been smashed to kindling, the posts ripped from the earth as if by a giant hand. The cattle that had been penned there were gone, scattered into the darkening wilderness. But it was not just the destruction of the wood that stopped their hearts. Nailed to the front door of the ranch house was a dead coyote, and carved into the wood of the door itself, deep and jagged, were words that gleamed white in the twilight. "The land or the woman? Choose." Ezra jumped from the wagon. He ran to the porch, ripping the carcass down and throwing it into the yard. He traced the letters carved into his home. Lucia stood behind him. She looked at the destruction, at the violence directed so specifically at her existence in this place. "He is not trying to scare us anymore," Lucia said, her voice hollow. Ezra turned to her. His face was a mask of cold, terrible resolve. "No, he is done playing." He looked at the scattered herd, at the smashed fences, and then at the legal papers in his pocket. The law would take months. Crow was coming tonight, or tomorrow. The war was no longer in the courts. Ezra walked to Lucia. He took her face in his hands. "I am not choosing," he said. "I already chose." He looked toward the bunkhouse where Dutch and Toby were running out, armed and shouting. "Get the rifles," Ezra called out to them, "and board up the windows." He looked at the darkening horizon where the dust of riders was already beginning to rise. "If they want a war," Ezra whispered, "let us give them one they will write songs about." Lucia reached into the wagon and pulled out her carbine. She worked the lever, chambering around. The metallic clack-clack was the only answer the night required. She stood beside him on the porch. "I am ready," she said. The December wind did not howl through the canyons of the New Mexico territory. It screamed. It stripped the heat from the stone and turned the sap in the mesquite trees to ice. At the Broken Creek Ranch, the cold was a siege weapon, testing every gap in the chinking of the log walls. Inside the main house, the air was thick with coffee smoke and the smell of gun oil. Ezra Holt stood by the fireplace, feeding splits of oak into the flames. He looked at the room. It was no longer a home. It was a command post. Dutch sat at the table, cleaning a Winchester with a rag that had seen better days. Toby was counting cartridges, stacking them like gold coins. Beside them sat Tom Miller, the rancher who had been burned out months ago, his hands trembling around a tin cup. And standing by the window, watching the dark road, was Lucia Reyes. She wore a heavy wool coat over her riding leathers, and her hair was braided tight against her skull. She looked like a soldier waiting for the bugle. Ezra walked to the center of the room. "We ride at dawn," Ezra said. His voice was low, gravel moving over bedrock. "The hearing is set for 9 o'clock. Abernathy says Judge Pemsel has tried to move the venue to the saloon back room to keep it quiet, but we are going to the town hall. We are going to make this public." Tom Miller looked up, his eyes watery with fear. Crow will have men on the road. Ezra, he will not let us get to the hearing. Then we go through them, Dutch said, snapping the lever of his rifle shut. Ezra looked at Miller. We need you. Tom, you are the only one who saw the kerosene cans in Rollins' saddlebags the night your place burned. If you do not speak, the law cannot touch Crow. Miller nodded, swallowing hard. I will speak. I am tired of running. Ezra turned to Lucia. The light from the lantern caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. She had not spoken in an hour. You do not have to ride in the front, Ezra said softly, crossing the room to stand beside her. You can ride in the wagon with Miller. It will be safer. Lucia turned from the window. Her eyes were dry and fierce. I am not riding in the wagon, she said. I am riding my horse, and I am riding next to you. Ezra started to protest, to offer the protection that was his instinct. But he stopped. He remembered the promise he had made. A partnership. If we do this, Ezra said, we do it all the way. They will try to tear you apart in that room. Lucia, they will say things that no woman should have to hear. Let them talk, Lucia replied. I have survived fire and whips. Ezra, I can survive words. The dawn broke gray and bitter. The landscape was a frozen ocean of sagebrush and rock, stretching out to the purple bruise of the mountains. They rode out in a tight formation. Ezra and Lucia took the lead, followed by the wagon carrying Miller and Abernathy, with Dutch and Toby riding rear guard. The road to Agate Creek was a gauntlet. Every ridge seemed to hold a shadow, every cluster of boulders a potential ambush. They rode with rifles across their saddles, their breath puffing in white clouds. 3 miles from town, they found the blockade. A wagon had been turned sideways across the road. 4 men sat on it, rifles resting casually on their knees. It was Stark, Crow's head enforcer, and 3 of the Texas regulators. Ezra held up a hand, halting his party. He rode forward alone, stopping 10 yards from the barricade. Move the wagon. Stark, Ezra said. Stark spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen mud. Road is closed. Halt. Washout up ahead. You will have to go back. There is no washout, Ezra said. Stark smiled, touching the brim of his hat. Official business. Sheriff's orders. Ezra heard the click of hammers cocking behind him. Dutch and Toby were ready, but a gunfight here would mean they never made it to the hearing. It would be called a roadside skirmish, and Crow would win by default. Then Lucia rode forward. She brought her roan mare up alongside Ezra's black gelding. She looked at Stark. We are not going back, she said. Stark laughed. Look at this. The help is giving orders. Lucia reached into her saddlebag. She did not pull a gun. She pulled a heavy brass bell, the kind used for signaling cattle in the brush. She rang it hard, the sharp, metallic sound cutting through the cold air. On the ridge above the road, movement flickered. 3 men stood up from the rocks. They were not Crow's men. They were prospectors, rough men from the high country who had traded horses with Lucia and respected her fair dealing. They held shotguns. We are not alone, Lucia said calmly. Stark looked up at the ridge, then back at the grim faces of Dutch and Toby. He calculated the odds. He was paid to kill, but he was not paid to die. He swore under his breath and kicked the brake on the wagon. Move it, he signaled to his men. The regulators grumbled but hauled the wagon aside, opening a gap just wide enough for a single rider. Ezra looked at Lucia. A flicker of admiration heated his chest, warm enough to fight the winter chill. Prospectors? He asked quietly as they passed the sullen enforcers. I fixed a mule for their leader last month, she whispered. I called in a favor. You are full of surprises. Miss Reyes, I am full of survival. Mr. Holt. The Agate Creek Town Hall was a drafty wooden structure that smelled of sawdust and unwashed bodies. It was packed. Crow had filled the front rows with his supporters, but the back of the room was crowded with townspeople, shopkeepers, wives, miners, who had come to see the spectacle. Judge Pemsel sat at a table on a raised platform. He looked nervous, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. Silas Crow sat at the plaintiff's table, looking immaculate in a charcoal suit, his face a mask of bored confidence. Ezra, Lucia and Abernathy took their seats at the defendant's table. The crowd murmured. The sight of a Mexican woman sitting at the legal table, not in the back, was a scandal in itself. Pemsel banged a gavel that sounded like a pistol shot. "Order," he squeaked. "This hearing regarding the petition of water rights for the Broken Creek Tract is in session." Crow's lawyer, a slick man from Santa Fe, stood up. He spoke for 20 minutes, weaving a tapestry of legal jargon. He claimed the survey lines were invalid, that Ezra was squatting on syndicate land, and that the ranch was being mismanaged to the detriment of the local economy. Then it was Abernathy's turn. "We contest the claim," Abernathy said, his voice ringing clear. "And we bring evidence of criminal coercion intended to force the sale of the land." Pemsel frowned. "This is a land hearing, counselor, not a criminal trial. It is relevant." "Judge," Ezra stood up, ignoring Abernathy's hand on his arm. "The syndicate has burned barns, poisoned wells, and threatened lives to clear the title on this valley." Ezra motioned to the back. "I call Tom Miller." Miller walked forward. He looked small in the large room, but he sat in the chair and swore on the Bible. Under Abernathy's questioning, he told the story of the night his ranch burned. He named Rawlins. He named the men he saw riding away. He told the room that Crow had offered him $50 for his deed the morning after the fire. The room was silent. Crow did not move, but his eyes narrowed. Then Crow's lawyer stood up. "Mr. Miller, you are a known drunkard, are you not? You owe money to half the businesses in this town. Is it not true that Mr. Holt paid you to come here today?" He helped me with food," Miller stammered, "but I am telling the truth." The lawyer smiled cruelly. No further questions. The hearing dragged on. A brutal tug of war. Ezra presented the original Spanish deed, which Abernathy read aloud. Proving the water rights were tied to the homestead, the judge looked uncomfortable. The law was on Ezra's side, but the power was on Crow's. Finally, Crow himself stood up. He did not address the judge. He turned to the crowd. "We are arguing over paper," he said, his voice smooth and projecting to the back of the room. "But the real issue is character. A man who cannot manage his own morality cannot manage the county's water." He pointed a finger at Ezra. "Ezra Holt stands here and talks about justice, yet he lives in open sin with a woman of low character, a woman who has no standing in this territory, a woman who—" Ezra slammed his fist on the table. The sound cracked like thunder. "Careful. Silas." Crow smiled. He turned his eyes to Lucia. "Tell us, Miss Reyes, or do you prefer a different name? We looked into your history. You came from the border. You lived in the house of Don Armando. We know what kind of women lived in that house. You were his property. And now you are Mr. Holt's property. You are a tool used to manipulate a lonely man. You are the rot in this ranch." The crowd buzzed. The insults were vile, designed to strip Lucia of her humanity, to reduce her to a stereotype that the town could easily discard. Ezra started to lunge forward, his face dark with rage. He was ready to kill Crow with his bare hands. Law be damned. Lucia put a hand on his chest. It was firm. She pushed him back into his chair. "No," she said. She stood up. She was small compared to the men in the room, but in that moment, she seemed to fill the space. She wore her work clothes, clean and pressed. She did not look at the judge. She looked at the women in the back of the room. She looked at the shopkeepers. Finally, she looked at Silas Crow. "I was in Don Armando's house," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was steady, carrying a resonance that silenced the whispers. "I was 18. He killed my father to take our land. Does that sound familiar, Mr. Crow?" She took a step forward. "He held me prisoner. He whipped me when I tried to run. I have the scars on my back to prove it." She reached up and unbuttoned the top button of her heavy coat, pulling the collar aside just enough to show the jagged, ugly white lines that ran up her neck. The room gasped. It was a map of brutality that no words could deny. "I am not a rot," Lucia said. "I am a survivor. I worked the land better than any man on your payroll. I saved the herd you tried to burn. I broke the horses you were too afraid to ride." She looked at Ezra, and for a second, her face softened with a fierce pride. I am not this man's property. I am his partner, and I am the forewoman of the Broken Creek Ranch. You call it sin because you are afraid of it. You are afraid of a woman you cannot buy and a man you cannot break." She turned to the judge. "You can steal the water. Judge, you can rewrite the maps. But everyone in this room knows the truth now. You are not fighting for the law. You are fighting for a thief." She sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a community's conscience waking up. Judge Pemsil looked at the crowd. He saw the faces of the miners, the wives, even the deputy, looking at Crow with a new, cold scrutiny. He realized the wind had changed. I will take this under advisement," Pemsil stammered. "Court is recessed." The chaos erupted the moment they stepped outside. Ezra and Lucia walked out of the town hall into the bright, cold sunlight. They were halfway to their horses when Stark and the regulators moved. They did not wait for an order. They saw their power slipping away, and they reacted with violence. "Hold it!" Stark shouted. He lunged for Ezra, grabbing his shoulder to spin him around. At the same time, another man reached for Lucia, trying to drag her toward the alley. Ezra reacted on instinct. He drove an elbow into Stark's ribs and drew his revolver, but he didn't fire. He was surrounded. Crow stepped out onto the porch of the town hall. "Arrest them!" Crow shouted. "They assaulted my men!" Deputy Vance hesitated. He looked at Ezra, gun drawn but held low. He looked at Lucia, who had drawn a knife from her boot and was holding the second attacker at bay. And then the town moved. It was not a dramatic charge. It was a wall of bodies. The prospectors from the hills stepped off the boardwalk. The blacksmith walked into the street holding a hammer. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, stepped in front of the deputy. "That is enough." "Silas! Mister!" Gable shouted. Crow froze. He looked at the faces. These were the people he had bullied, bribed, and intimidated for 5 years. But Lucia's testimony had broken the spell. They saw the scars. They saw the reality of his greed. Stark looked around. He saw 50 armed citizens closing the circle. He released Ezra and took a step back, his hands raised. "It is over," Stark said to Crow. "I am not dying for your water rights." The sheriff, a man who had been conveniently absent for weeks, finally pushed through the crowd. He looked at the mood of the town and made the only political choice left to him. "Crow," the sheriff said, "we have a warrant for your arrest regarding the arson at the Miller place. Mr. Miller just swore out the affidavit." Crow looked at Ezra, his face twisted with hate. "You won nothing. Holt, the ranch is dead." Ezra holstered his gun. He put his arm around Lucia, pulling her close. "The ranch is just dirt. Silas, I have everything that matters. The victory cost them." The ride back to the ranch was slow. Ezra had a split lip and a bruised rib from the scuffle. The legal fees would take half their savings, and the herd was still scattered. The winter would be hard. They would have to sell the best horses just to buy grain. But when they rode under the arch of the ranch gate, the feeling was not of defeat. It was of ownership. They dismounted at the barn. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the cracked earth. The wind had died down, leaving the air crisp and still. Ezra handed the reins to Dutch, who was grinning through a swollen eye. "Put them up, Dutch." "Extra grain tonight." Ezra walked to the porch, but he did not go inside. He stopped and leaned against the railing, looking out at the mesa. Lucia joined him. She stood close, her shoulder brushing his. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the first stars appear. "I spoke to Abernathy before we left," Ezra said. Lucia looked at him. "About the trial?" "No, about the deed." Ezra reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a folded document. It was not a court order. It was a transfer of title. "I signed over 50% of the Broken Creek Ranch to you," Ezra said. "It is filed with the county clerk. It is legal and binding." Lucia stared at the paper. She did not take it immediately. "Ezra, you said you would never let a man hold the deed to your life again," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion. "I meant what I said in that courtroom. You are my partner. If we starve this winter, we starve together. If we prosper together. Your name is on the land. Lucia. No one can ever put you off it. Not Crow, not the town, not even me. Lucia took the paper. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the ink. Seeing her name, Lucia Reyes, written in the script of ownership. It was the first time in her life she had owned anything that could not be carried in a saddlebag. She looked up at Ezra. Tears stood in her eyes. Silver in the starlight. You are a fool. Ezra Holt, she whispered, giving half your land to a stray. Ezra turned to her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears. I am the smartest man in the territory, he said. He kissed her. It was not desperate like the kiss in the rain, or restrained like the moment in the hotel. It was a promise. It was deep, slow, and filled with the quiet certainty of a man who has come home. I have one more question, Ezra said, pulling back just enough to look into her dark eyes. Lucia smiled, a true, unguarded smile that lit up the night. If it is about cooking, the answer is still no. Ezra laughed. It was a good sound. No, I was going to ask if you would marry me. In the spring, in the daylight, in front of the whole damn town. Lucia looked at the ring of mountains surrounding them. She thought of the prejudice that would still be there tomorrow. She thought of the hard work ahead. And she thought of the man standing before her, who had fought the world to stand at her side. In the spring, she said, in the daylight. The story ends not with a wedding, but with a ride. It was early morning. 2 days later, the sun was just crowning the eastern peaks, painting the desert in hues of apricot and violet. Ezra and Lucia rode the southern boundary line. The air was cold, but the horses were fresh. They crested a rise and stopped, looking out over the valley. The ranch lay below them, battered but standing. Smoke curled from the chimney. The cattle were grazing in the lower pasture. Ezra looked at Lucia. She sat tall in the saddle, her hat pulled low, her eyes scanning the horizon, not for threats this time, but for possibilities. She felt his gaze and turned. What are you looking at? She asked. Everything, Ezra said. He reached out his hand. Lucia took it. They sat there for a moment, hand in hand, two scarred people on tired horses, holding the line against the vast, indifferent world. Then, Lucia squeezed his hand and released it. She gathered her reins. Come on, partner, she said, spurring her horse forward. We have fences to mend. They rode down the slope together, into the light. Thank you for journeying with me through the dust and determination of the New Mexico territory. Ezra and Lucia's story is one of grit, dignity, and the kind of love that isn't just felt, but fought for. I would love to hear your thoughts on their journey. Please leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. Until the next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.